For anyone who's not familiar with us, I am Kelley Challen. I'm a transition specialist, and I run Challen Education and Transition Services, where I work with teens and young adults with disabilities and their families and their schools around planning for life after high school. A lot of my work focuses on college readiness, life skills, and helping students build the self-advocacy skills that they will need as they move into adult life. Eliabeth, I will let you introduce yourself so that I don't miss anything critical, because you do a
Oh,
lot.
it's all very important, yes. So I'm gonna move a little and just see if I get under more light here. I'm Elizabeth Hamblet. I am the author of a book I should go grab in a moment. 7 Steps to College Success: A Pathway for Students with Disabilities. And I am, thank you, Kelley. She's my best spokeswoman. I am a longtime college learning disability specialist. I have been working in college disability services offices for 20 plus years. One of these days I'm gonna add the 5 on the end and do the math. So I right here on Substack, I often refer my readers to Kelley's wonderful work. I have a free YouTube channel. I have a blog on my main website with 60 posts. So I'm always out here trying to help folks understand the changes at college for students with disabilities. And Kelley's specialty is in telling everybody how to make sure that they're ready. So that's why we work together.
And I didn't mention this, but hopefully you can see this or you might be accessing through this. I write a Substack called Planning Beyond the IEP. And that's for multiple reasons. It's because I'm always thinking about planning for life after high school, but also because I truly believe that transition planning is a model of thinking about planning for the future that's relevant for anyone, whether you're on an IEP or not. And
Agreed.
when I focus on transition planning, I'm just always thinking about living, learning, and working goals, where students are with those skills now and where they want to be with those things in the future.
And
So,
I
yeah.
was gonna say, Kelley, I bet often you get the same comment I do when I talk about academics preparation for college specifically, because that's my bailiwick. People will say, "Well, that's these are good ideas for all students," to which I say, "Yes."
Yes. And I think I think this particular generation of high schoolers, college students, even sort of individuals in their 20s, there are ways that this generation of young people struggle with a lot of different things
Mm,
that sometimes are consistent with folks who have learning disabilities and are neurodivergent. And you may not have a diagnosis, but you still might struggle with executive functioning, or you may not have a diagnosis, but you might not self advocate the way that a student self advocated 20 years ago.
right.
So I think there are a lot of life skills also that end up being things that apply to all students. But when we're talking about students with disabilities, there's sort of unique challenges that some of our students struggle with.
Well, and
So,
also,
yeah.
I would say that, when you and I have talked about this, it's one of the concerns is because sometimes people do things for students with disabilities. They adults drive certain things that our
Hmm.
students don't get the same practice and opportunities to build skills that some of their neurotypical classmates might get because we're very focused sometimes on accommodation and making things run smoothly or bolstering success for students when that can run counter to the goal of trying to build those independent skills.
Absolutely. And I also think if your child has a disability and it's your oldest child or your first child, I think sometimes it can be incredibly hard to know, right? Parents are not always experts on their child's diagnoses. In fact, they often are not. And when it's your own child, even if you're a clinician, your perspective on your child ends up being different. And so I think also sometimes there's a real lack of understanding about how competent a student can be at a certain age, right?
Yeah,
And
right.
so we may be over helping without realizing we're over helping, missing that
Mhm.
there's competency there that's untapped. Um, So we really got into it. If you haven't joined us before for Transition Tuesday chat, Eliabeth and I try to do these quarterly now, which is exciting. I think this is actually our fourth time speaking together in the last year. Maybe I think we did
Yeah.
2 on Facebook and 2 on Substack Live. Um, and so, certainly, we're both really passionate about this transition from high school to college, being successful college students, even thinking about what happens after college. But we also kind of try to talk about whatever's current in the lives of students at the time that we're holding the chat. And since it's March, we were thinking about seniors who are making decisions and getting ready to head off to college in the fall. And then also thinking about juniors who are sort of starting their college search process, their college application process, thinking about what's going to I was going to say make or break the college transition, but sort of thinking about what's going to make their transition most successful. So we certainly welcome questions. You can type those in at any point while we're
Yeah.
talking. But we also have some questions that we thought we would jump into together. And I imagine we could talk for an hour about this first question, Eliabeth,
As always.
which is, just that I think whether you're working with juniors or seniors or you're parenting juniors or seniors in high school, something that I hear all the time as students are preparing for college is my child had an IEP in high school or my child had a 504 in high school. So they're definitely going to get support in college, right? Just thinking that because you had an IEP or because you had a 504, you're definitely going to be supported in college. And there's a lot to unpack with this idea. But how do you tend to explain what actually changes when students are moving from high school to college, especially students who've already been on a plan of some sort?
Right. So the most important thing that families and professionals need to know is that whether students have an IEP in their senior year of high school or a 504 plan, neither one of those plans travels to whatever phrase people use with you, is legally applicable, holds, obligations for colleges. IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, under which your student has an IEP, does not apply to colleges. And so, for that reason, those plans don't apply. Subpart D of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, to be quite specific, is the one that covers K-12 schools, and colleges are under Subpart E. And so, for the same reason, those plans also don't apply at college. So, I had written last week and shared with you, Kelley, a post that I just put up on Substack on Sunday, because what those myths tend to lead to are questions that I always see at this time of year. So it's March, what is it today, the 24th? And, all at schools all over the country, there are teams writing final IEPs for students who are either graduating or, for just to get them through the rest of the year, if in some cases, or for next year for their senior year, or they're writing 504 plans. And online, I see people saying to each other, well, what should I make sure is in my student's final plan? What wording will make sure and cement their chance to get support, will give this plan teeth when they go to college? And also, what accommodation should I make sure the case manager writes into the plan so that my student can get that at college? And that is not how any of that works. And so I've just explained those plans are invalid at college. So what the Substack explains, preview, is that there are some colleges who might view it. Some colleges may ask to see it. A number of colleges won't. Every time I do a presentation in a different state, I tend to look at that flagship state university's documentation requirements. I don't think I've ever seen anybody require that high school plan as part of students' documentation. And documentation is just a fancy word for the paperwork that students submit when they go to college if they want to register with the Disability Services Office, which they don't have to do. So they submit it even if it's not asked for, what weight it will carry. Because I also get that weird question sometimes, "Well, Elizabeth, does a 504 plan or an IEP carry more weight when a disability services office is considering whether a student is eligible for accommodations?" And I don't see that come up in my professional community. Nobody's ever talked about it. Um, and I don't know, I can't speak for them and offer an idea of what they would even say. But I would just make sure that if you are the parent of a current high school senior who is college bound in the fall, what you need to be doing is looking at the documentation requirements right now for the schools that they've already applied to, or in many cases been accepted to already, so that wherever your student is going to choose to go in the fall, you know what documentation they need. So, like, let's dispel a couple of myths right here, Kelly. So, you'll have heard that testing for learning disabilities has to have been within 3 years. True in some places, not true in a lot of others. You're gonna hear from other parents, "Oh, before your kid goes to college, get them pay for a neuropsychological evaluation because that's gonna get them more accommodations," or whatever they think better accommodations are. That's not the case either. So, there's a lot of stuff, and on my, main website, which is lvadvisory.com, if you just look up my name, Hamblet, it should get you there. Go to free resources, go to the documentation landing page, and you're gonna see myths about college documentation that addresses a lot of this. Um, so,
And
you asked me about the shift. We don't have child find at college.
right.
So your students have to identify themselves to our office. They can find the process to do that online. That doesn't mean they bust through the door with their best jazz hands and say, "I'm Elizabeth and I want to be registered." But they follow whatever the process is. It's usually a form. Everything at college requires a form, so it's good practice. Sometimes they have to have an intake meeting with us. They submit their documentation, but as you alluded to, eligibility for accommodations isn't guaranteed by history. Colleges get to decide who is eligible for accommodations, and that's a longer discussion than we have time for tonight. But, when you talked about that they're thinking about their students getting support, support can take a lot of different forms at college, and people look at it differently. For some people, it's just accommodations like extended time for tests, permission to record classes. For some students, they want to have an executive functioning coach. That is not something that disability services offices have to offer by law. And if they do want to provide some kind of coaching, they can hire anybody they want to do that job. They can hire upperclassmen or even other freshmen. So, what families are accustomed to, at least in public school, state certified special educators, is not something that colleges have to provide, and most don't.
Yeah. I appreciate you tackling some of the myths that families, and it's not just families, it's also professionals working with high school students. It can even be college
Yeah,
counselors working with high school
sure.
students who may not be well versed in disability supports, in particular at the college level. Um, one of the myths that you didn't mention, but that I know you and I both often hear and have to dispel in our work, is the myth that students who are on IEPs should transition to being on a 504
Oh,
plan
how could I forget that
before they
one?
before they have finished
Thank
high
you.
school, because it's going to, travel better to college. And
Right.
I appreciate you really explaining this idea that it doesn't matter whether you're on an IEP or a 504 plan in high school, it's going to effectively expire before college. What I do think is often missing from that myth or that conversation is that there is a benefit to students being able to function with reasonable accommodations towards the end of high school and being less dependent on things that are modified for them in high school, because those types of things are quite different at the college level. And you started to go into some different accommodations. And we talked extensively the last time we spoke with one another about accommodations and modifications. But I think, there should never be a justification of moving a student from an IEP to a 504 plan just because that student wants to go to college. Those are unique decisions, right? And at the same time, students who really don't need to be on IEP plans anymore. I say plan, it's really just IEP because it's plan or program.
It's
Students
late
who,
for us.
yeah. Yeah, but students who really don't need to be on an IEP, you don't want to be holding on to that. You want students to
Mhm.
be used to performing work with the right amount of support for them. And I actually did write a Substack specifically on that topic, really talking about not hanging on to plans that students don't need anymore, because there's a real benefit to functioning with whatever amount of independence you can function with. Yeah.
And parents are concerned about letting go of an IEP. I see, parents sometimes wanna ask me, well, they wanna, discontinue or whatever the right word is, my student's IEP, and, you know, will that matter at the college? It depends on why they're doing it, and if they're doing it because they've evaluated the student formally and the students, and this is I only come at this through the lens of LD and ADHD because that's my area. But if they don't see a substantial limitation in the student's functioning based on the evaluation that they have, colleges may not accommodate a student whether they have the plan or not. And I forgot to mention too. There's I've got a video on my YouTube channel and that accompanies a post that I wrote for the main blog on what happens for students who've never had access to an IEP or a 504 because they were privately schooled or they homeschooled. So you can read all about that. But if you want to see the discussion of what Kelley was alluding to about modifications to work expectations, see our last Substack on Kelley's account for December. And the written post we just published, what, 2 weeks ago?
Yeah, 2 weeks ago.
So, and let us invite you to post your questions too. We preloaded some, but we're happy to answer yours too. But I've done enough talking, Kelley. Let's talk about you.
Well, no, I actually, so you started to just sort of dive into some of the kinds of supports, um, maybe that are common in college or that students might be looking for in college. I do a little bit of college counseling. My background was originally in guidance counseling, but mostly for students in the Northeast, and actually usually for students who have autism spectrum disorders, because that's where I started professionally, although I work with students with all diagnoses at this point in my career. But a lot of times when a family comes in to work with me, they do one of two things. They have either somehow on the internet found a list of colleges that are specifically supposed to be good for students with learning disabilities, and they come in and
Yeah.
you can just tell where the list came, that it's like all of the
We've all seen
common
that list.
colleges that have learning support programs, right? Curry College and the PAL program there, and then Arizona State and the SALT program there. And you just know that the list was just which colleges have good learning support programs, right? And then they've put together a
Right.
list of 10. Or a family will come in and the priority for the student, more than anything else, among college search characteristics, is looking for a college that has support. We want the most support for our kid.
Mm.
And I guess I'm just curious from your perspective as somebody who interfaces with so many different disability service professionals across the country. Um, what would you say that families might look for if they know a student needs a lot of support? And then what might you caution families about in terms of, navigating a search specifically around support that they think a student's going to have in college?
So I think again, as I said at the start of this conversation, support means different things to different people. And so sometimes what a student is really seeking is a very small personalized environment, in which case you have to find one. So I love that you brought up that list of a couple of dozen colleges because we've all seen it on the internet or, and I have a post and a video about what's the best college for students with dyslexia, et cetera, because I get asked that question all the time. So, the first thing to keep in mind is what the student is looking for. And that is where I'm sure you, and we should talk about this, see sometimes some, butting of heads where parents are looking at students saying, I don't know how Elizabeth is going to manage at college. She has to go to a school. And let's be clear, these lists that we're talking about, in my experience, almost exclusively list schools that have fee-based support programs. And that word is really, really important. So I'm not going to jump out of frame because then I'll never get centered right again. But over on my bookshelf over there is the K&W Guide to Colleges for Students with Learning Differences, they call it, and ADHD. And at the back of that, the edition I have, they list these programs that are fee-based, that provide additional support, and they are structured. But then they also, I think, kind of confusingly refer to other kinds of offices that are just disability services offices. I think they call them like a not, forget what the wording they use, but they refer to them as programs, and they're not programs.
Right.
So literally, like every college in the country has to provide accommodations unless a school doesn't take any federal funding, which means literally like 99.99% of every college in the country, and is a private religious school. So really any place your student wants to go has to at least provide these basic accommodations. And then what people are sometimes looking for when they talk about support is going beyond that. So instead of just providing accommodations, like UMass Amherst, I know provides learning specialists to students, but I think like you get a certain amount of access in your first year and that's free, which is why it's not a program. And it's not more than that. And I think over time you get less access to that person. Some of my colleagues have specialized career advising that's available to students just through the Disability Services Office for students who are registered with no fee. So that seems like support. But then what sometimes parents are looking for is what a fee-based program provides, where students meet 2 or 3 times a week, and there's a special study room, and they do Salt Center at University of Arizona is like the granddaddy of all of this and kind of the OG as far as what it offers. They do have, I think, specialized career services. They might even do specialized counseling. But when I interviewed directors of 3 programs for the book, and you can see that information in step 5, one of the things they said was, your student has to want to use these services.
Yes.
And the same is true for just the Disability Services Office. We cannot make your student register with us. They are adults at college, even if they're not 18 yet. And so if they don't want to identify with our office, they don't have to.
I had, it was the presentation. Elizabeth and I just did a live presentation together in DC not that long ago. And I was talking with parent while walking over to a dinner there. And this particular parent had picked a college with a support program that
Ah,
had a number of wonderful supports, was really thinking that this was going to be perfect college, perfect level of support for this student. Well, when the student got to that college, the only way to access the services that were all being paid for as part of that fee-based support program was to actually travel about 10 minutes off campus to where the support program was hosted. And that alone was too much for this particular student to navigate, right?
yeah.
And what hadn't been practiced or built in ahead of time was any sort of practice navigating over there, or the fact that that was just going to make the student too anxious. And so ultimately the student transitioned out of that college, but they picked the college. They thought they had the right level of supports,
Oh,
not
yeah.
realizing the amount of independence and navigation the student would have to do to just get to those supports. And I think parents can really forget or not appreciate, or students aren't aware of the fact that even when we say it's a support program, the student is often still responsible for the scheduling of those supports, right? The communication with the staff around those supports, and also making sure that they show up at the times that they are supposed to be there. And if you're really lucky, if you have an incredibly compassionate, learning specialist or tutor that you're working with, maybe they're going to send you some text messages to prompt you that you're supposed to be at your sessions, but oftentimes you're going to miss those services, and you may not be able to make those up. So I guess it's just really you need to ask a lot of detailed questions ahead of time to understand whether the supports that you think you might be getting at a college are being delivered the way that you think, as a student, that you think you need them.
I think that's a really good point, and that if that I'm so heartbroken for that student because, they kinda had the right idea, but I think, Kelly, and I think it's a great time to shift this over to you. So I'm making my usual funny faces that my social media manager will then pull a still to mock me with. Um, I get very excited about this work, but, just today, the first appointment I had, student didn't show up. Now, when I make an appointment with a student, we talk about it, we pick the time. Theoretically, they're putting it on their calendar, but I also send it to them as a calendar invitation. It comes as an email that theoretically they're going to click accept and it's going to go on their calendar. Now, that's a backup because they themselves should be putting it on their calendar. Student had accepted this invitation and just forgot. And so I am not sending reminders to students, and our system is not set up for that. Um, I imagine colleges will eventually shift over to texting students, but right now my office does not text.
Oh,
We do not text. And so students have to adapt to the system that's there. And so as I'm talking to you about this and I'm thinking about your end of this, students really need a bunch of skills, which includes managing their emails and setting aside time to look at emails every day. I know they're getting inundated. They need a system because they're going to miss stuff. Like even the invitation to
yes,
schedule an appointment with me the first time comes by email. And I get,
absolutely.
either students I never hear from who got an invitation. There are students who email me months later. And also, I usually have the ability to see them, but not every, they're going to miss stuff. So let's shift this over because I think when we talk about supports, what a lot of families are still envisioning is a lot of, again, and I keep using this expression when you and I chat, adult driven supports, where somebody
Hmm.
that's not the student is responsible for communicating to the student, reminding the student, telling the student to do things. And that is not what college looks like at all.
No, it's much more student driven. And
Yeah.
I think, I mean, I'm still grappling with this fact that you won't text a student because I think
Yeah.
about any student that I work with, high school, college, young adult, and how dependent they are on getting a text message to remind them to actually show up to our
Mm-mm.
appointments. And
Mm-mm.
thinking about weaning that a little bit for my students. Although there are students that I work with where I suggest that the level of handholding or the level of adult driven support that they still need when they're
Mm-hmm.
transitioning to college means that they might need a private pay support that isn't a fee based college support program, that
Right.
is a private academic coach, or that is a more private college support program that you contract with a specific agency to provide, where you
Mm-hmm.
can get that next level of handholding, but you
Mm-hmm.
still don't get somebody who shows up in your dorm room and wakes you up in the morning or keeps you on on schedule with the level that you would need to be on schedule. Um, but there is this assumption or thinking that colleges should or can do things that they are just not able to do the way that they
Or
are
won't.
staffed and the way that the programs are built. And first of all, families should read your book. The
Oh,
reason
thank
that
you.
I don't actually have this book here because Eliabeth and I were doing this Substack Live tonight. I have it here because the families I'm working with who are closer to making this transition, or just families who are thinking about college in the future, I always suggest reading it. And I'm really excited because I am somebody who has grown less capable of reading as an adult, especially with um, a teenager now and a late elementary school student playing a lot of sports. But I absolutely love being able to listen to audiobooks, right? And Elizabeth's book is finally going to be in an audiobook format coming this fall. I think it's October. And I ordered it. So
Yeah, and they won't charge you until it's
yeah.
ready, and if my voice is annoying you, don't worry, I'm not narrating.
But I'm excited because to be able to listen to it, refresh different chapters, and Elizabeth has done a nice job of consistently updating it with current information, talking to different people. So it's not the first edition; it's the third edition. Um, and I can't recommend it enough in terms of starting to really read and think about and understand that there are some large differences between what we have grown accustomed to as commonplace needs for students in high school and what really is available and reasonable as far as an accommodation or a support in college. And there's a lot that students need to be doing and starting to do on their own to make that transition. I do just want to say one more thing about college search because students might be
Yeah,
thinking
please.
about that. And I do think it's very important to understand what kind of support a student needs and to ask great questions to understand what kind of support is available at a school and how a student actually accesses that. And again, really making sure that there's a fit between the skills the student has or the skills the student can build in time for college and being able to use the support that's provided at the college or getting a sense of whether additional support is needed. But I also think, particularly in this day and age, there are a lot of different ways to access support for students. There are support programs provided by people who will come on certain college campuses for students, right? There are any number of executive function coaches. There's quality variability in those coaches. And so you want to make sure you get good referrals for those folks and sort of proven track record of being successful with college students in particular. Because again, being able to tutor or coach a high school student is not the same as being able to coach a college student effectively. But also don't forget basic things that anyone without a disability would be searching for in a college, right? Culture matters. Feeling comfortable on
Yes.
the campus matters. And also having things you might be interested and motivated to study matter.
Yeah.
Sometimes schools that are quite small or schools that have
Mhm.
really good LD programs because they were built for students with learning disabilities may have qualitatively different majors than other
Right.
universities or may have more sports or less sports than other universities. It's still important to pick a college that you're going to be excited to be at, that you're going to get engaged in the activities, that has something you want to study that you can persist in studying, or has a couple of majors you might be interested in to move around to. You don't want to only think about whether the support is there because you can have all the support in the world. And if you're not
Yeah.
interested in any of your classes, you're not going to be successful. So I want to make sure people are balanced when they're thinking about starting this process and getting a sense of what would be good or, about different schools for that student.
Right, and some students who maybe are coming from a very small kind of high school want to replicate that in a very small school or do the opposite and go to a huge school. But I'm so glad you mentioned that the culture, is it a party culture?
Mhm.
And is that going to make your kids really socially uncomfortable on the weekends if everybody college students statistically drink less than they did back in the ancient days when I went to college, but if going to parties is not something that they wanna do and it's something that would make them uncomfortable that everybody's doing it, or the opposite, where, there are schools where students study all weekend, and maybe your student would like to go where students take a different approach to their free time. So, But I wanted to ask you something because, and folks, on my YouTube channel, I think it was 2 years ago, I had a panel of people from, one from Landmark College, which is one of the colleges that's just for students with, learning disabilities, ADHD, and autism. Somebody from the University of Arizona Salt Center, which is a fee-based program, and then somebody from College Internship Program, which is not affiliated with a college at all. It is just an outside program, and it's called College Internship because students live in an apartment that's shared. They learn basic living skills. They usually take a class or two at a local college, but they're living off campus and just getting, adult skills, excuse me. So when you said sometimes there are people who go onto campus, I was very intrigued by that
I
because
was yeah, I was thinking
yeah.
specifically of Focus Collegiate,
Ah,
which has there's a larger sort of Boston-based group of folks
sure.
working with them. But there are some larger executive function groups in New York City and some other parts of the country where there are service programs that have built up, where they're basically learning support programs that are not connected to a particular college, but what they're providing is academic coaching, some social coaching, usually on the campus, or helping students get connected initially to things. They may have summer experiences for students to get adjusted to college. So there are those kinds of things. But it will be. What were you going to say about them going onto the campus?
What I was gonna say is I wanna make sure that, listeners understand what it does. It just means they're literally going to meet with your student at a place your student locates.
Yes.
They are not talking to professors. They are not coming into the disability services offices and telling us what your student needs for
No.
support. They do not have a role to play at all in the environment of the college except where your student finds a place where they can meet with this person, and it's probably not gonna be the library because
Right.
depending on the school where I work, you need an ID to go in any building.
And it's very interesting. For instance, in Massachusetts, there's a program. Easter Seals has a college navigation program, and this is specifically originally designed for young adults with autism spectrum disorder who are matriculating to college and might need a little extra social and executive function support, and even just again, I'm going to use the term handholding, but adult-driven support to first get connected to disability services, to tutoring services on campus, to other things. And there are some colleges, it is true, colleges have very specific security measures. These are quite different, again, than 20 years ago. But each college is different in terms of where those navigators are allowed to meet with students or not meet with
Mm,
students. And
right.
so, again, if you were to work with a private support program and not an actual support program on the college campus, you would want to know that they have experience working with the college that your student's going to, and that they have a sense of where they could meet or not meet with a student, and really that whatever they're promising is what they can deliver as far as a supportive coaching experience for the student. So
Yeah.
it is different by college. There are some colleges that you can get in and out of buildings,
Mhm.
without IDs in their eye. And again, that's something also when you're looking at colleges, thinking about like what are the security protocols that matter most, and where's the college located and things like that. But it is
And,
interesting that there are differences.
one of the things that came up too when I was interviewing the folks from the fee-based programs was, and if you want to, right now on my Substack in that, post that I just put up on Sunday, or just email me and I'll send you the code. I'm offering a discount right now through the end of March on my webinar on academic accommodations in college, because what's really important, or you can read it in step 7, is knowing what things support your students probably are not going to get. And I, vaguely referred to adult driven accommodations. But the reason I mention this is sometimes people think, well, if my student pays for the fee based program, they'll get some of the accommodations disability services said no to. And that is not the case. So I just want to be really clear about that. And I see Data Advocate joined us, and
I
she was at
know. I
our
was excited.
she was at our live presentation 2 weeks ago. And we keep talking, but because we're waiting for questions. But if not, it's time for me to turn this around on Kelley. um, and started asking her. So I'm being the big bad wolf here, saying all the stuff we don't do at college. So let's talk about how do you help adults prepare students for this transition? What kinds of skills are they working on? What are you seeing and what do you emphasize when you meet with families?
It's interesting because, I mean, it depends where we are in this process. So when you were talking specifically about executive functioning, a little bit checking email I was thinking of that for executive functioning. I started to think about the students who are actually selecting colleges right now, preparing to head off in September. And one of the biggest differences, if you're a parent who went to college and you're now parenting a teenager who's heading off to college, it's like we showed up on campus and filled out a bunch of paperwork
By
and you had
hand, by
orientation and
hand.
everything that you were doing as part of college enrollment happened on the college campus for the most part, or it was a
Yes,
packet that you did in advance, or maybe you dealt with
right.
it in orientation weekend. But the college enrollment process now is this really prolonged process, which means it's a huge executive functioning exercise for our students that are heading off. There can be a whole checklist of temporally based activities that a student has to do in terms of placement exams and sending in a photo for an ID and making sure that you're getting your health paperwork in. And so anywhere between the time a student actually enrolls in the college and the time the student, arrives on the campus, there can be things that student needs to do on a weekly or monthly basis. And it requires not just checking email, but often also checking, the student portal on the college's website or multiple student portals on the college's websites. And so I do think, it's like students have to be practicing time management, task management,
Absolutely.
technology management, and students who struggle with that, it is a perfect time to have high school staff or to have a coach or as parents if you're going to to start coaching them on how to create some systems for themselves so that they can maintain some routines and time and task management when they get to that college campus.
Yeah, that's so important because, you really have to set the time aside
Mhm.
because they just get going and they're like, "Oh my god," and then what happens is that inbox fills up and then they're so overwhelmed. The counts I see on emails, make me wanna cry.
Right.
Uh,
Well, even teaching students to filter emails or how
yes,
do you
it's so
mark things
important.
as important? How do you
Yeah,
put something in a calendar, not just and how do you label it in the calendar so you know what it is and what the important details were? I
right.
mean, there are so many of these, again, the time and task management kinds of activities that students who haven't had to manage a web-based calendar and a number of portals themselves may not quite be ready for. So they just need some help thinking about how to build those systems initially and then practice using those systems before they actually hit the college campus. We talked a little bit about the accommodations process, and I just went through this with a student this morning who has already picked the college that they are going to enroll in, but has not reached out to disability services at that college yet to start the process. And I know you're saying it's only March and school's in September, so who cares? Well, as we started to explore with disability services what kinds of documentation that student was going to need, it became clear that the documentation that was needed was too outdated for what this student actually needed and didn't specifically recommend some of the accommodations the student was going to need. And so
Mm,
they had some documentation that was about 6 years old that
wow.
was enough for this student to actually be able to get some extended time at a local community college because the student has started to take some community college classes but was not going to be enough to justify something like an underload of coursework, when away at college at a four-year college
Interesting.
in the
Okay.
fall. And the student may not need updated testing. The student might need a letter from a therapist. It's going to really depend on that college
Right.
and what they would require in terms of the accommodations the student is specifically requesting.
That's interesting too because, what sometimes happens is, um, students will submit their documentation and make their requests, and we will say, and I'm speaking for all 4,000 plus colleges in the country, will say, well, Elizabeth, you're approved for this accommodation, but not that. And sometimes the student will say, well, what do I need to get that accommodation? And it's not always that more is going to be the case or that updated is going to be the case unless, the picture looks extremely different. But then I would have questions if a student
Right.
came in with testing from, let's say, eighth grade that presented, kind of a picture of their cognitive and academic functioning. And then, 6 years later came in with testing that made it look like, and I'm not being facetious and I'm not trying to hurt anybody's feeling, like they had a brain injury
Right.
because there was such a decline in the
Right.
scores. So we do know that with proper remediation, academic skills tend to
Yep.
improve and over time. And some cognitive skills will change, despite what a lot of parents believe. Cognitive profiles can change over time with maturity,
Right.
development of, further development of the brain.
Well,
Yeah.
and to the same, I mean, to the same, and I happen to have come from working. I'm not a neuropsychologist, but I worked with neuropsychologists for 12 years, and I also just read a lot of neuropsych testing in my work. And I mean,
For fun.
yeah, for fun. I know it is enjoyable, especially when it's done well, right?
Yes.
um, but by the same token, cognition can go the other direction. Like there are times
Yeah.
that students do lose verbal abilities, or students
Mm.
lose processing speed and working memory kinds of things. It's particularly affected by mental health issues. It can be affected
Sure.
by a student who had a brain injury or had seizure disorders over time. Like there
Right.
are things that can cause cognitive profiles to shift, and so. I know that oftentimes you don't need fancy or expensive neuropsychological testing
Mm.
specifically just for, current accommodation recommendations. But sometimes it's been a really long time since good testing was done for a student.
Sure.
And you have real questions about readiness or capacity to take a full set of courses in college. And there are times when it's really important to get updated testing. The other thing that I just sort of mentioned that sometimes doesn't require testing but might require, again, letters, are for students who have ongoing mental health issues
Mhm.
or mental health crises that come up cyclically, or other things like that that may need some accommodations around that. And then sometimes medical notes or therapist notes or other things like that can be used to establish that. And it's not to say, each college might look at differently what kinds of documentation they need, which accommodations can be provided based on certain documentation or certain kinds of things. But there are times that something has come up that is new that wasn't there 6 years ago. That's
Mm.
very real
Sure.
and does require just a little bit of different documentation, and it's because something has changed substantially.
Right. Right.
Um, and then there are times that nothing has changed. And students are
Right.
just seeking a different accommodation. And I've seen that before too, where there have been accommodations provided as part of a 504 plan, or accommodations that were in an IEP that were simply put in place when a student was in fifth grade, and they've sat on the IEP year after
Mhm.
year after year, and they were never actually accommodations that the student needed or qualified for. And that's a heartbreaking challenge for a student who's used to getting, say, 100% extra time on tests, but actually doesn't have any disability related reason that they
Right.
require extended time to complete that type of activity.
Yeah. And let me see if I can get that thought back. We were talking about accommodation. Then sometimes there's no testing that's going to get students the accommodation they're requesting because it's
Right.
not something we do.
Yep.
Nobody's going to make your student a study guide. That's not an
Yeah.
accommodation. So whatever evidence you provide, it's just not something that we do. But let's
I
talk.
had
Yeah.
can I ask one quick question on accommodations,
Yeah.
because this came up recently, and I am sure that you have written about this, and I've probably even read about it somewhere.
No, let's give me a go.
But for students who need both, let's say, extended time or a separate test setting, and then they want to be able to ask clarifying questions,
Yeah.
I think a lot of times students are used to in Massachusetts, it's like a standard accommodation for testing can be familiar test taker, right? And you can't get a familiar
Hmm.
test taker in a college setting. But a lot of times, if you have a familiar test taker, that may come with a lot of, like a lot of interesting accommodation that maybe isn't necessarily described clearly. And so students may be
Interesting.
used to that and
Wow.
wondering, how can I interact with a test administrator during testing? And are there ways that students are allowed to ask questions or other things during tests, or is that just completely unreasonable?
It's gonna depend. Okay, well, it's a couple of things, and I just want to say hi to Anna Willis because I see she joined us. Um, okay, wow, that's a new idea to me. So, way that accommodating testing happens at college really vary. Just like everything, your mileage will vary on all of these topics. So, at the 2 places where I work, accommodated testing is in a separate room from where the professor is giving it to the rest of the class. There is a hired proctor to do it. Is that going to be a familiar what was it? What's that?
Familiar test administrator.
Only if they just happen to get scheduled with the same proctor, and often proctors are upperclassmen or grad students who are doing this for money. And so how many questions like, the it's not generally the person who wrote the test
Right.
who's there with you. Now, some professors will provide the extended time in their class. So here's what I see my colleagues saying in our community is professors usually have to provide some way for a proctor to communicate a clarifying question. But it might be something like, is there a word missing in this in question number 14? What we're not doing at college is a lot of explaining test
Right.
questions. And I've
And
seen that
restating.
request, restating the test questions.
Yeah.
The expectation is students will be able to comprehend the questions. If they have a reading disorder, we can, provide them with a laptop fitted with text to speech to literally read them the words. But interpreting test questions for students is not something we do. And so, we talk about the skills that they need. And if that's being done for them, it is hard. Teaching comprehension like that is hard, but if a student can't pass a test without somebody always being there talking them through it, that means that they're gonna need a lot of adjustment before they're ready for college exams.
Yeah. And I think there can be a tendency to not be teaching vocabulary. I had a parent
Mhm.
in a team meeting recently say, when I was a kid, we had vocabulary lists every week and we were memorizing vocabulary, and I don't see my kid
Mm,
doing that. And I don't know if that's a one-off experience or a common experience. It's something I don't
mhm.
see a lot for students, even yeah, vocabulary goes through a certain point in time. And for students who have language-based issues or, um, sensory impairments that affected reading or other things, there can be a need to continue building vocabulary. And instead,
Interesting,
what
yeah.
happens is that there's an automatic accommodation of somebody restating things for them all the time, right? Sort of simplifying
Interesting.
directions, restating
Exactly.
things. Students who attend really small schools that are specifically for students with dyslexia or language based learning disabilities or things like that. Everything might be modified and restated and sort of put into simpler vocabulary terms. And so there can be a need to really build up vocabulary before college, and that's important to pay attention to and not just be restating, but also be thinking about whether there's actual vocabulary instruction needed to make sure that students can manage college level vocabulary. And there, with
Yeah.
in this day and age where testing is optional at many colleges, there can be a tendency to say, oh, you don't need to take standardized testing. You don't need to take an SAT or an ACT because that won't be required for college admissions. And I always push, as long as a student could sit through a college placement exam, without having a panic attack, and you can talk about the fact that it's just being taken to see how they do, that it doesn't have to be submitted to the college. I think there's a real value in knowing how you perform on, on
Truly
language
standardized
literacy
test.
and truly standardized math, right? Just
Yeah,
things that other students across the country are doing who are preparing for college. I think students
mhm.
have a right to know how they perform in those tests. And sometimes they
That's
perform
such a
way
good
better than
point.
anybody expected. But I think it is helpful to have some of that
Yeah.
standardized feedback, especially if you have been in a smaller private program, or had some really different kinds of programming in high school. But we got very far away from things that students should be doing right
I
now
feel like you've
to
been
prepare
dodging
for
my
college.
question all
And
night.
yeah, no, and I think what we haven't really talked about much yet are the non academic kinds of things, right? I mean, we've talked about executive functioning, we've talked about self advocacy, we've talked about some of these, what's reasonable and unreasonable in a classroom or for testing. But the other things that we need to be working on with students, whether they're juniors or seniors or earlier on, are the other kinds of skills that you need to be a college student. Some of the social kinds of skills, some of the life kinds of skills, some of the, oh boy.
So I interrupted you to say, which Kelley has outlined beautifully on her 31 skills you need for college Substack. So she's been, fluffing me up all night. It's my turn. So, we're going to run out of time very soon, but make sure that when
Oh
you are done
gosh.
with this conversation, also, I'm going to run out of
We'll put it in
batteries.
the show notes. Yeah. I'll have
Yeah.
you send me some, any of the, any links that you've mentioned that we can put in our show notes. And
Yeah.
then I'll put together some of the Substacks that I have that are relevant. This is your last chance for anybody who's here. We have a good set of attendees tonight. So if anybody has a question that you want to ask either of us really about anything related to transition planning for life after high school, for preparing for college, about services for students in college, accommodations, making the transition with learning disabilities. This is your chance to chat in and then write a message below. I feel like we're doing an infomercial, Elizabeth, like, this is your chance to purchase this
Yes.
for the price
Time
of
is running
free.
out. We have
You can
30
ask
minutes
both
left.
of us a question, which I like so appreciate being able to ask you questions regularly, Elizabeth, because you're just a wealth of information in terms of thinking about this. But definitely check out those 31 skills for college and really think about the life skills. Think about, being able to manage a small budget or purchase things for yourself that you might need on a weekly basis. Or again, wake up on time without anybody
It's a big
reminding you,
one.
without an extensive routine,
Yeah.
doing laundry.
I
I
had a student just yesterday, we were trying to figure out their schedule for the week, and they said, "Oh, well, actually, I absolutely must do laundry tonight." And I didn't ask questions because I don't want to know. But yeah, that's part of a routine night that they have to get used to. Um, and I want to say, I think we're going to save that one story we'd be discussing. So to get people to come back when we do this again, I guess, what is it? When April, May, and June, June, we'll do this
June, we
again.
can still talk about life
Um,
skills to practice over the summer for college. So,
But I can't stress enough, you really must subscribe to Kelley's Substack. I do, and I read the posts as soon as they come in. And I reference them all the time. But, here's big scary Elizabeth telling you all the things that aren't going to happen for students at college. And I don't want that to be the only message you take away. What I want you to take away is you can prepare them for this. And Kelley's going to teach you how. Go to her Substack, read her stuff and really start thinking about, where is your student now? Because wherever your student is, if it's their senior year, what you learn may be that perhaps September isn't the right time for them to start with full on 4 year living at college. And there are lots of different ways to go to college. There are lots of different times to go to college. And so, what we both want, and Kelley talks about way more than just going to college after high school. And that's also why you should read her stuff. Um, but we want that transition to college to be one that is successful. And successful is defined different ways, which is what we were going to talk about today, but we'll do it the next time. Don't we always get off track? But that it's gonna be a good experience for students. It's gonna be challenging because it's challenging for all students, but that you have done the best you can to make sure they have the best possible chance at a good start because you've made sure they have those independent skills, because all the academic skills in the world aren't going to matter if your child and their children's, can't handle themselves at
Yeah.
college, can't manage their time, can't manage their responsibilities, can't ask for help when they need it. None of that stuff's going to matter. And
Mm.
you've written about, how good grades can mask where the deficits are.
We have a question.
Yay! Oh, I hope my phone doesn't die.
So
If
the
I conk
question
out,
says, and of
everybody.
course now my phone's falling.
Yes.
It says, I'm struggling to determine what is more important for success: a school with robust support and is run down but has amazing caring professors, or one with less robust of an accessibility department that has shiny enhancements that interest my student, like an esports arena.
Oh.
There's so much to that. I think I think it does matter letting your child have a voice in this process, right? If a student has a really strong sense that this is a particular school they want to go to and good reasons and activities that they are willing to join, that's very important. But just playing esports, right, is not the same as passing classes. So I tend to always talk about, especially this time of year with families, like college is an enormous investment: time, emotions, resources, real resources, right? And so to really think about, what is it that you're afraid would go wrong at the school with the shiny enhancements? You know, and you could do something like download my 31 must have college readiness skills and go through that and really look at which of the skills do you feel like your students ready for, which are they not ready for. You can look at other sort of like landmark college of the checklist, but some of those skills are on my checklist as well. But really thinking about, what are the skills that you think your student doesn't have yet that you were thinking would somehow be more supported by the professors at the other school or more supported by the program at the other school? And are there ways to replicate that at the
Mhm.
school that you're looking at? Or
Right.
are there ways for your student to demonstrate that they have some of these skills prior to going to school, right? You have 6 months here before starting school, or if you're a year and a half out. So you can really sort of negotiate and say, hey, I'm happy to have you pick this college. Here are the things that are missing. So here are the things that you're going to need to do to be
Mhm.
successful at the other college. And here are the things you're going to need to show me in the next few months before we put down the final check at that college. I do think, I talk with a lot of people who support college students with college transition or who run support services for college students. And there's an X factor that's very unpredictable with students. When you have a motivated student,
Yeah.
there are things they can do that they somehow never could do when they were at home with their parents. And so, a student in the right setting or the school that they feel they can be most successful at, again, with some reasonably calculated supports for them, may do much better than you could ever anticipate. So I do think the student's motivation is huge in this process. And if there are things that you recognize that they could be doing that would also help them to be more successful when they hit the campus, this is the time to evaluate that and kind of negotiate around that with them. You can't send a student to a school they don't want to be at and have them be successful. Again,
I
nicest
agree.
professor in the world, they're not going to show up if they don't want to be in that classroom.
I
So
agree, and if they're
it's
unhappy
really
in the
important.
environment, yeah, I think that's
Yeah, and if they don't have the clubs that they want to be part of, right?
yeah.
Or they don't want to go to the clubs because they don't like where they're housed. So, um,
Another question too is, is the school in an area where there is access to esports and they could find, take a
yes.
bus and get somewhere? And I realize that's like a pretty specific thing, and hard to imagine it. Like, if it's a school out in the middle of the woods, perhaps there's not nearby another place for that. But I think that was excellent advice from Kelley, and I agree with everything she said. So,
And there are
ditto.
some nice, I was gonna say, there are some colleges that don't have dingy campuses that also have esports too. So there might be an expansion of college list,
Yeah.
potentially, although I don't know where you are geographically. Thank you for our lone question
Yeah.
asker. Elizabeth, you've mentioned your Substack, you mentioned your website. Are there other ways that people can find your book? Definitely buy her book, especially the audio
Mhm.
version that's going to be out this fall. But are there other places people can find you or other things that you want people to
Gosh.
know?
Well, like you, I'm on social, so I post something every day that I think is helpful. Very often it's a post from Kelley's Substack. But yeah, I'm sort of everywhere. Just Google me. And like I said, if you're watching this in March, go to my Substack to the post on misunderstanding. What is it? I don't even know what it's called. I should. Whatever March last Sunday's post was about packing a
Yes.
final IEP or 504 with accommodations and get the discount code for my webinar through the end of the month, or read step 7 of the book from to get that detailed information about what accommodations your student will potentially have access to and won't. And
Yeah.
Kelley, where should people find you?
I'm pouring my heart and soul into this Substack
She
right now.
truly
So,
is. She is
so
working
I
so
I
hard.
do I would recommend subscribing. It's free. I
Yeah.
don't paywall content, but I do appreciate when people pay to support this because I really try to put information that I think families need into the newsletter on a weekly basis. I am pretty good at Facebook, although I don't think Facebook thinks so in terms of how it runs its algorithms. But I would definitely, if you like social media, I post everything on Instagram and Facebook. It's pretty similar content, so choose one of those if you really like getting your social media that way. If you're professional and you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, I'm on there as well,
Yeah.
and tend to put a lot of information there. And just like Eliabeth, I am a very Googleable human, so if you happen to be interested in direct services, consultation, or inviting one of us to speak. We do a lot of
Or
public speaking
together. I
or
like
speak
speaking
together.
together.
Certainly we have websites and you can find me at challentransitions.com and Elizabeth, your ldadvisory.com. Yes. Yeah.
ldadvisory.com, which I usually spell,
So
but my phone's about to die. So just Google my name and it should come up.
all right. So we're going to end before Elizabeth's phone ends this for us. But thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you, Eliabeth, for being willing to continue doing these Transition Tuesdays with me. It's always a lot of fun, and I learn something every single time we talk.
Thank you, Challen. One of these days, I'm going to make you let me ask you questions. So join us in June and see if I
And
accomplish
Sharon, Eliabeth gets to be the
Put
host.
Kelley in the hot seat.
All right.
Have a
Thank you
good
so
night,
much. Have a great
everybody.
night, everybody.
Take care.